Welcome to the haunted halls of Street Helena Hospital, a place where time bends, memories linger, and the fever never sleeps. You're about to witness the story of Evelyn Hart, a nurse caught between life, death, and something far older, far darker. If you love horror that chills to the bone, suspense that never lets go, and stories that haunt you long after the screen fades, then make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, because wherever you are, the fever might be closer than you think. Asterisk, music swells slightly, then fades into a slow, dripping echo as the narration ends. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. By the fourth, the sound of it began to feel like breathing something alive, pressing its weight against the walls of Street Helena Charity Hospital. Nurse Evelyn Hart arrived at dusk, soaked to the bone. The carriage driver refused to go near the hospital gates after sundown, saying, "The dead there still wait for medicine." She left it off then. But as she stepped through the large mahogany doors, she realized the hallways smelled not of disinfectant, but of rust and old candle smoke. There were only 7 patients, but twice as many empty beds. And yet, she could swear she heard coughing in every corner. The head physician, Dr. Ackerley, greeted her with a tired face. "The nights are long here," he warned. "And the fever never truly leaves." He didn't look at her as he spoke. His eyes kept drifting toward Ward 3, the one they said had been closed for a decade. That night, Evelyn took her rounds by candlelight. Every corridor seemed to stretch longer than before, like the building itself shifted after dark. Then came the sound, soft humming, a woman's voice, singing an old Bengali lullaby. But there were no women on that floor, no one alive, anyway. Evelyn followed the sound, her candle trembling. At the end of the hall, Ward 3's door was open just an inch. Through that crack, she saw the outline of a woman pale, with her back turned, hair wet as if she had just come from the rain. A nurse's uniform, the old kind, torn, blood-stained. "Hello," Evelyn whispered. The woman turned. Her face was white linen wrapped tight. No eyes, no mouth. Only the faint outline of lips stitched shut. And as Evelyn dropped her candle, the woman spoke from inside the cloth. "They never discharged me." The candle had rolled across the stone floor, its flame dying in the damp. Darkness swallowed the corridor whole. Evelyn stood frozen, unable to breathe. The whisper still lingered in the air. "They never discharged me." But when she dared to open the ward door, the room was empty. No woman, no cloth. Only 7 abandoned iron beds, each one rusted through, and in the corner a wooden chartboard covered with old hospital ledgers, eaten by mold and age. She lit a lantern and stepped closer. Dates: 1742, 1743, 1744, all the way to 1749. Each page marked with a name and cause of death, fever, cholera, infection, and then a separate column titled Disposition. All 7 nurses before her, every single one listed as discharged. But the ink used for discharged was fresh, newer than the rest of the record. Someone had altered them recently. Dr. Ackerley found her there, trembling, staring at the pages. He scolded her for entering the ward. "You don't go in there after dark," he said, his voice low and trembling. "The hospital breathes differently then. You'll disturb them." "Who?" Evelyn asked. "The ones who cared too much," he replied, and turned away before she could ask again. That night, the rain became violent. The windows shuddered as thunder crawled through the sky like a wounded beast. Evelyn couldn't sleep. Every few minutes she heard footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate, wet. She opened her door. The lanterns were still burning, but the hallway was empty. Only the reflection of her own light shimmered on the polished marble tiles. She followed the sound again, heart pounding. It led to the morgue, a damp underground room beneath the hospital where the air was always colder. There, she found something she hadn't seen before. A small wooden trunk beneath a draped table. Inside the trunk were nurse badges, rusted scissors, and folded pieces of white cloth, each with a name stitched in black thread. 7 names. But the 8th was hers. E. Hart. The thread still wet, with black dye. Her lantern flickered. Behind her, the voice returned softer this time, almost kind. "You shouldn't have opened it, sister." Evelyn spun around. The stitched woman stood there again, her face veiled, holding a blood-soaked patient chart in her hand. And this time, the figure stepped closer, leaving wet footprints on the stone, each one steaming. In the cold air, the lantern went out. The morgue door slammed. From behind the dark, 7 more silhouettes rose from the tables. Nurses, all in decayed uniforms, all moving toward her in silence. When the morning staff found her, Evelyn was sitting on the floor of the morgue, still breathing but unable to speak. Her eyes stared blankly at the wall, and beside her, the open trunk now held 8 badges, all identical. The morning came pale and gray, the sun struggling to break through clouds thick with monsoon sorrow. The nurses said Evelyn had fainted exhaustion, they whispered. But none dared mention what they saw in the morgue. Not even Dr. Ackerley. He forbade her to return there. He even sealed the stairwell with iron nails. But Evelyn remembered everything. The faces, the names, her badge, already waiting for her in the box. The hospital smelled stronger that day, not of herbs or medicine, but of copper and mildew, as if the rain had seeped straight through the patient's lungs. There were only 7 patients, but Evelyn kept hearing an 8th cough, ragged and wet, from the far end of Ward 2. Every time she pulled the curtain back, the bed was empty. Only the pillow slightly indented, as though someone had just risen. At lunch, she approached Dr. Ackerley again. "There's someone else in the ward," she insisted. Ackerley's face tightened. "You're mistaken. I heard them, doctor. I even saw." He slammed his teacup on the table, porcelain cracking. "You'll do as you're told, Nurse Hart. This hospital has rules, and silence is one of them." She wanted to protest, but then she noticed his hands. They were trembling violently, and around his wrist, the faint imprint of linen thread, like something had been tied there too long. That night, the storm returned. The power of the rain was such that even the candles flickered with fear. Evelyn made her rounds again, whispering prayers under her breath. In Ward 2, she saw movement behind the curtain, a faint shape under the sheet. She lifted the lantern, her heart a hammer in her chest. "Who's there?" A cough answered. Deep, heavy, close. Evelyn pulled the curtain aside and screamed. On the bed lay a man's body, gray and bloated. Eyes open, lips stitched. He wore a patient's gown soaked through with stagnant water, and on his chest lay a tag that read, "Admitted, 1,749. Discharged, never." She stumbled back, the lantern shaking. The corpse began to move, not sit up, but breathe. His chest rose once, twice, and from his mouth came a whisper, the same lullaby she had heard in Ward 3. Through the growing darkness, the curtains of the ward began to sway, though no window was open. The other patients groaned, tossing in their beds, as if some invisible fever passed between them. Evelyn fled. She ran through the hallways, calling for help, for Ackerley, for anyone, but every corridor seemed to lead back to Ward 2. And then she saw them again. The 7 nurses, standing at the far end, silent, their faces hidden in white veils. The stitched woman stepped forward and said softly, "When the doctor lies, the nurses pay." By morning, all 7 patients were dead. No wounds, no struggle, their bodies simply cold and still, eyes open toward the ceiling. And at the foot of each bed lay a small white cloth, folded neatly, stitched with the name E. Hart. The monsoon had turned the city into a fever dream. Outside, the Ganges swelled and spilled its banks. Inside, the air hung heavy with mold, rot, and whispers. The walls of Street Helena's seemed to sweat with the storm. For 3 nights, no one spoke of the patients found dead, Doctor. Ackerley had their bodies taken out before dawn, their beds scrubbed clean with vinegar, their charts replaced with blank pages. Fever outbreak, he said. Nothing supernatural, he said. But Evelyn noticed how he could no longer meet her eyes, and how, whenever thunder struck, he'd flinch like a man who knew what waited in the dark. That evening, as Evelyn made her rounds, she overheard the servants talking in the laundry room. They spoke in low, hurried Bengali. "He keeps them under the west wing. The dead nurses?" "No, the ones he couldn't save." When she entered, they froze. One of them, an old washerwoman with cloudy eyes, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth and whispered in English, "Miss, don't go near the west doors. They hear everything you say." That night, Evelyn waited until the bell struck midnight. The halls were silent, except for the dripping of rain through cracks in the ceiling. She carried a single lantern and followed the map she had seen once in the doctor's study, the hospital's old blueprint, drawn in ink and bloodstains. There, in the margin, was a section scratched out completely, a hidden corridor that led west. She found it behind the chapel, the wall slightly hollow when tapped. With trembling hands, she pressed against it. The plaster gave way. Behind it a door, iron, locked from the outside. Carved into its frame were words faintly visible under the lantern glow. "Ward 0 condemned." She should have turned back, but curiosity in Street Helena's was a contagion, and she was already infected. The key hung in the doctor's office, beneath a cross. It was rusted, heavy, and too cold to be ordinary. She opened the door. The smell hit her first sickly sweet, the scent of rot and chemicals. Inside, rows of beds stood in shadow, bodies, not buried, not burned, preserved, floating in glass tanks filled with a yellowish liquid. Some were men, some women, but all wore nurses' uniforms, their eyes open, their lips sewn. Each tank marked with a label, Stage 3, the fever of the mind. A voice behind her, "You weren't supposed to find this, Doctor." Ackerley stood in the doorway, lantern in hand, his face as pale as wax. He didn't look angry, he looked terrified. This hospital, he said, was built on a promise. The Crown wanted cures, not for disease, but for obedience. They brought us nurses from London, Calcutta. Madras told us we were saving lives. But every fever they treated began here. He pointed toward the tanks. These were the trials, Miss Hart. They wanted to stop death itself. and instead, they taught it how to stay. Evelyn's voice shook. And the women? They volunteered, he said. But once the fever took the brain, they wouldn't die. They lingered between worlds. Something moved inside one of the tanks. A pale hand pressed against the glass. Nails blackened, skin bloated. Then another. Then another. All 7 began to stir at once. Dr. Ackerley dropped his lantern. No. The flames spread quickly. The tanks hissed and cracked. Evelyn screamed as the glass shattered, spilling the liquid across the floor, and with it, the corpses began to rise. 7 nurses, eyes open, threads loose around their mouths, stitches snapping as they whispered through ruined lips, "You promised us rest." When the smoke cleared, the West Wing was sealed again. Dr. Ackerley was never seen after that night, but Evelyn was. Standing by the chapel door at dawn, soaked in rain, her hands trembling, and her own lips freshly stitched with black thread. The next morning dawned with a false calm. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in weeks, sunlight broke through the clouds. But inside Street Helena's, no one smiled. No one spoke of the West Wing, or the fire that left scorch marks on the chapel wall. Dr. Ackerley was gone. His office stood empty, his books soaked, his journals missing except for one torn page Evelyn found caught beneath his chair. It read, "The bell rings only when another crosses over, but sometimes it tolls before they die." The chapel stood beside the hospital, an old structure of red brick and colonial timber, its cross rusted black by the monsoon air. Inside, the air always felt colder than outside, as if the walls had trapped centuries of breath. That evening, Evelyn went to pray not for faith, but for silence. But as she knelt before the altar, she noticed something strange. A rope, hanging down from the ceiling, leading up into the bell tower freshly frayed, as though someone had pulled it from above. And yet, no one had rung that bell in decades. At least, that's what the priest used to say before he vanished last year. The night grew thick and heavy with fog. The hospital slept uneasily. Even the oil lamp sputtered and died before midnight. Evelyn woke to the sound she had feared most, the bell. It tolled once, then again, slow, deep, hollow. She ran barefoot to the chapel, lantern trembling in her hand. Each ring echoed through the corridors, not like sound, but like heartbeats. When she reached the chapel, the doors were already open, swinging on their hinges, though the air was still. Inside, the candlelight flickered violently, painting the statues in shadows that seemed to breathe. She looked up toward the bell tower. The rope moved on its own. With every toll, a faint sob seemed to whisper from above. She climbed the narrow spiral staircase, her lantern light shaking against the brick. The air grew colder the higher she went. At the top, the bell loomed massive, ancient, its bronze mouth green with age. The clapper moved by itself, slamming into the side in perfect rhythm, as if an invisible hand commanded it. And then she saw her. A woman stood behind the bell, her white nurse's dress tattered, her hair dripping as though she'd come from rain. Her lips were unstitched now, black thread hanging loose from the corners of her mouth. Her voice was barely a whisper. "The bell rings for the living, before they die." Evelyn stumbled back, trembling. "Who are you?" she cried. The woman stepped forward, her eyes hollow but glistening with something human sorrow. "I was Evelyn Hart. Once." The bell rang again. And at that moment, Evelyn felt something split inside her, a sudden coldness that shot through her chest like an invisible needle. Below, the hospital came alive with screams. The patients, every one of them, had begun to seize and choke in their beds. The bell rang once more, and then stopped. By dawn, 4 more patients were dead. Their eyes open, their lips blackened, as if burned from the inside. The doctor's quarters remained empty, and the priests refused to enter the chapel. They claimed the bell rope moved on its own, and that each morning, a nurse's shadow could be seen kneeling at the altar, even when the chapel was locked. That night, Evelyn wrote in her journal, "I hear her now, the woman who bears my name, the one who died before I ever lived here. She calls me sister, but I do not yet know why." The hospital had grown quieter, not with peace, but with fear. The servants avoided Evelyn now. They said she walked like a woman following footsteps only she could hear, and sometimes they swore they saw her reflection move after she did, but Evelyn didn't notice. She was too consumed by what the ghost had said. I was Evelyn Hart, once. Days passed. The monsoon returned, drowning the city in black rain. Each night, she woke to the faint toll of the chapel bell. One slow note, never more. And always, just before dawn, she'd hear a whisper in her room. Find the ledger, sister, the one written in blood. On the 7th night, she obeyed. She went to the records room, a low-ceilinged chamber filled with cabinets swollen from moisture. Most of the pages were ruined. The ink melted into unreadable stains. But behind a loose brick in the wall, she found a locked drawer, small and iron-bound. Inside lay a single leather book, its cover dark and sticky with dried blood, the blood ledger. She lit her lantern, sat on the floor, and began to read. Each page listed names doctors, nurses, patients, and beside them, their assigned date of discharge. But there were no causes of death, no diagnoses. Only one symbol repeated beside each name. A small cross turned upside down. The first page bore a familiar signature, Dr. Ackerley. Under his column, status retained. She turned the page. More names, nurses she'd never met, some from as far back as 1738. Every name was crossed out until she reached the last. Evelyn Hart, discharged, 1748. Her hand froze. 1748. That was 2 years before she'd arrived in Calcutta. She flipped the page again, and there, written in trembling ink, were words that didn't belong in a hospital ledger. The experiment repeats. The body returns. The mind forgets. The fever chooses its vessel anew. A chill crawled through her spine. Her candle flickered, and she looked up. Someone stood in the doorway. It was Dr. Ackerley, alive. His face was pale, blistered by burns from the West Wing fire. His eyes were wild, hollow. He stepped into the light and whispered, "You shouldn't have read it. You're dead," Evelyn breathed. "I was," he said, voice cracking. "And so were you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a daguerreotype, an old photograph, faded but unmistakable. It showed a group of nurses standing before the chapel. At the center, her, Evelyn Hart, same face, same eyes, but the year written beneath, 1748. Her breath faltered. That's impossible. Street Helena's was never a hospital, Ackerley said. It was a vessel, a trap for the fever that kills but refuses to leave. When the Crown abandoned the project, it found new hosts, nurses, healers, those who touched the dying. He looked at her, almost pleading. Every time it needs a new vessel, it wears her face. Evelyn Hart was the first and the last. The walls groaned, the lights dimmed, and from the hallway came the sound of wet footsteps, approaching slowly like someone dragging the weight of their own grave. The air thickened with the smell of rot and rain. The lantern's flame turned blue. Ackerley backed away, trembling. "It's too late now," he whispered. "She's come to reclaim herself." The footsteps stopped at the door. A shadow fell across the wall, two figures overlapping, identical. Evelyn turned, and there she was, the other Evelyn, her face pale and wet, her eyes full of quiet rage. "Give it back," the ghost said softly. "My name, my life, my fever." When the staff entered the records room the next morning, they found only one figure sitting in the corner, calm, silent, and smiling faintly. Evelyn Hart. Her hands were stained with ink and blood, and before her lay the open ledger. The last page. Now. Read, Evelyn Hart retained. The days after the ledger blurred together like dreams bleeding into each other. Evelyn couldn't tell when she was awake anymore. Sometimes she'd blink, and the world around her shifted. The lamps became oil torches. The uniforms changed. And the faces of the nurses she knew melted into strangers who looked at her as though they recognized her too well. The fever had come. But it wasn't a sickness of the body, it was a contagion of time. Each night she would wake in a different year. One moment the hospital stood quiet and old. The next it gleamed new and bright, filled with voices, prayers, and ambition. She saw the day street. Helena's had opened the ribbon cut, the priest blessing the halls. She saw herself there, standing beside Dr. Ackerley, both younger, both full of purpose. And then she saw the first patient die, convulsing, bleeding from the eyes. She saw the fever bloom, spreading from ward to ward, until the chapel bell tolled without hands. One night, as the thunder growled outside, she awoke to find herself in the old uniform, the one from 1748. The linen apron, the stiff collar, the embroidered initials E.H. sewn by hand, and in her hand a scalpel, fresh with blood. The walls around her were alive with whispering. She followed the sound down to the basement, where she found a door she'd never seen before. It was marked simply, "The Fever Room." Inside, the air pulsed with heat, wet and alive. Rows of iron beds lined the walls, and on each bed lay a patient burning with invisible fire, their skin glowing faintly red in the dark. Beside each one stood a nurse, all with the same face, her face. They moved in rhythm, tending, wiping, whispering. When one turned, Evelyn felt her knees go weak. It was the first Evelyn, the original. Her eyes were calm, almost motherly. "Now you understand," the woman said. "The fever isn't a plague. It's a keeper. It remembers what men forget." Evelyn shook her head. "You're not real." The woman smiled sadly. "Neither are you." The air thickened, rippling like water. Images flickered around her, the burning West Wing, the bell, the corpses in the tanks, all at once, as if she were walking through memory itself. The first, Evelyn reached out her hand. "Every nurse who comes here carries it. The fever isn't in the blood, it's in the mercy. You feel too much. You heal too much. That's how it enters. Evelyn's voice trembled. And if I stop feeling, then you die. But if you keep caring, the woman's eyes filled with tears that never fell. You stay here forever. The fever room pulsed once more, the heart of Street Helena's beating through stone. The beds trembled. The patient's eyes opened in unison, glowing faintly with fever fire. Evelyn screamed and ran through corridors that bent backward, past stairways that led into fog, until she found herself back in her own bed. Her uniform was dry again, her hands clean, the ledger gone. But outside her window, in the reflection of the rain-slick glass, she saw 7 figures walking the courtyard, all nurses, all identical, all looking up toward her window. And among them, the first Evelyn stopped and smiled. "Soon, you'll remember the end," she whispered. By dawn, the fever had spread. 2 more nurses were missing, and the hospital's clocks had stopped at the same hour, 2:13 a.m., the time the fever room first appeared. The rain had ceased, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than thunder. Inside Street Helena's, even the rats had grown quiet. The air was stale, thick with candle smoke and secrets that refused to stay buried. Evelyn's hands trembled whenever she tried to write. Her diary entries no longer began with "Dear God," but with "Who am I today?" That afternoon, a new patient arrived, or so they said. He was found at the gates, drenched, muttering Evelyn's name. The attendants thought him delirious. Another fever case dragged in by the river's flood. But when Evelyn saw him, her heart stopped. She knew his face, a man with hollow eyes, his skin pale as paper. He smiled when he saw her. "Miss Hart," he rasped, "you haven't aged a day." He was placed in the isolation ward. No one else dared go near him except her. When she entered, he was already sitting upright, hands folded neatly over his chest as if awaiting confession. "You shouldn't be alive," she whispered. The man chuckled weakly. "You said the same thing the first time." She frowned. "I've never met you before." "Yes, you have," he said. 20 years ago, I was your patient. The fever took me, and you bled me to death to stop it from spreading. I thanked you for it, remember?" He leaned closer. "And then I woke up again." She stumbled back. His eyes followed her every move, cold, unblinking, too aware. "You were the first to find it," he said softly. "The fever wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to copy. Every body it entered, it learned, imitated, perfected. When you killed me, it learned you too." He raised his trembling hand. "I've seen you die, Miss Hart. I've seen you die many times." The lantern flickered. Evelyn felt the floor sway, the walls pulsing again, like something alive beneath the foundation. Outside the ward, faint sobs echoed down the hall, the other nurses whispering in unison, "The fever keeps what it loves." The man began to cough, blood blooming like ink across his gown. But his smile never faltered. He pressed something into her hand, a pendant, old and corroded, engraved with 2 letters, E.H. "I carried it," he said, "through every death, every return, every fever. You gave it to me, before you burned me alive." The room went cold. The oil in her lantern froze in its glass cup. Evelyn stared at the pendant. It was hers, identical to the one still hanging around her neck. 2 pendants, 1 heart, 2 histories. Suddenly, the patient sat up, eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear it?" he gasped. The bell, it's for me!" Before she could answer, the chapel bell began to toll. Once, twice, and as it rang, his veins darkened, his mouth opened, and the same song the ghost had sung poured out of him, word for word, in her own voice. Then, silence. He fell backward, lifeless. Evelyn stood frozen. The air hummed faintly, and from his still chest, a whisper escaped. "Now it's your turn again." The next morning, his body was gone. No burial, no record, no name. Only a blank space in the patient log where his entry had been. Evelyn searched the ward for traces of him, but found only a smear of blood on the wall, shaped like an open eye, and written beneath it, in her own handwriting, "He dies, so she remembers." That night, she dreamed of fire again, of herself standing among the burning beds, holding the scalpel, and through the smoke, the other Evelyn whispered, "You killed him to stop the fever once. You'll have to do it again." Rain returned before dawn, falling not in drops, but in sheets that rattled the roof like bones. The ward stank of damp linen and lamp oil. Every mirror in the hospital had been covered in cloth, a custom begun after too many nurses claimed to see faces that were not their own. Evelyn tried to laugh at the superstition, but laughter came hard when even her shadow no longer obeyed her. She'd wake to find her reflection still standing in the glass basin across the room, head tilted, eyes following her with a patience too deliberate. At first, she thought it was exhaustion. Then, the reflection smiled before she did. That morning, she tore every mirror from her quarters and carried them to the waste pit behind the chapel. Yet that night, when she opened her door, one waited on her, desk unbroken, gleaming, rimmed with frost, and carved into its edge were the words, "See me." She lit a candle and stared. Her reflection blinked slower than she did. The eyes were the same, but deeper, darker, filled with memories she didn't own. "Who are you?" she whispered. The image's lips moved a heartbeat later. "The one who stayed." The flame flickered blue. Around her, the room dissolved into the color of ash and water. She was standing in the old hospital. Again 1748. The walls new, the candles tall, and the corridors echoing with distant prayer. The mirror was now a window. Through it, she saw the original Evelyn Hart tending to a dying patient, the same man who had returned at the gate. He reached for her, begged for mercy. She whispered, "Forgive me," and pressed the scalpel beneath his ribs. Then she smiled through tears, the same smile Evelyn had seen in her reflection. The glass fogged, then cleared. Now the reflection leaned close, pressing its palms against the inside of the mirror. Lines of dark thread ran across its mouth, the stitches she had once seen on the ghost. With each word, the thread split and bled. "You thought you escaped me," it said, "but we are the same fever, in different flesh." Evelyn stumbled back, her candle dropping. The mirror's surface rippled, and a cold breath poured from it, the smell of formalin, rust, and the west wing's burnt air. She turned to flee, but the door was gone. Only walls, mirrors upon mirrors, each one reflecting her in slightly different motion. In some, she was older, in others, stitched. And in one, her body hung from the bell rope in the chapel tower, swaying with every toll. She covered her ears, but the bell rang anyway, not from the chapel, but from inside the mirrors themselves. A voice joined it, hundreds of her own voices, overlapping, whispering, "Remember the cure, Evelyn. The fever was never meant to die. It was meant to multiply. The mirrors shattered all at once. Glass cut her palms, her cheeks, her arms. When the last shard fell silent, she was back in her own room. Only one sliver of mirror remained small enough to fit in her hand. In its reflection, her lips were still moving, but she hadn't spoken a word. By morning, the nurses found her sitting beside her bed, staring at the shard, whispering over and over, "She breathes when I don't." That night, the mirrors across the hospital began to reappear, hung perfectly on the walls, though no one had replaced them. Each one fogged from within, as if someone were breathing on the inside of the glass. The rains did not stop that week. Thunder bruised the sky in constant waves, as though the heavens were coughing up ghosts. Inside Street Helena's, the wards were nearly empty. The patients who survived begged to be moved elsewhere. Those who didn't, their beds stayed warm long after the bodies had gone cold. Only Evelyn remained, and her reflection. It began with a sound like water dripping behind her eyes, slow, rhythmic, relentless. Every lamp she lit went out within minutes. The corridors whispered her name through the wind vents, but when she followed the sound, she always ended up standing before a mirror. One night, while patrolling the west corridor, she saw something impossible. A figure stood at the far end, her exact height, her exact dress, her exact trembling hands. But her face was calm, peaceful, and she was walking toward Evelyn, barefoot, each step leaving no echo. "Stop," Evelyn said. The figure smiled. "Why would I? I'm finally free." Her voice was not an echo. It was hers, her true voice, but softer, older, more assured. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching her lantern. "What are you?" "I'm what's left when guilt rots into purpose," said the reflection. "The fever was your child, Evelyn. You birthed it with your mercy killings, your experiments, your desperate prayers for a cure. You fed it every time you whispered a patient's name before you cut their throat. The walls behind the reflection pulsed faintly alive, breathing in rhythm with the thunder. Each brick seemed to expand and contract. In the flicker of lightning, faces pressed out from within the plaster mouths sewn shut, eyes weeping black tears. Evelyn dropped her lantern. The flame exploded in oil and shadow. The reflection stepped closer, and with each step, reality bent inward. The air rippled. The corridor stretched the floorboards, twisting like veins. By the time Evelyn looked up, the reflection stood before her, separated by nothing but a thin shimmer of air. "Please," Evelyn whispered. "I tried to save them." "You did," said the reflection, tilting her head. "You saved them from dying too soon." The reflection reached out a hand. Evelyn felt her own hand lift without permission, mirroring the motion. Fingers touched, flesh to flesh, and the world fell silent. She awoke in her bed, or what looked like her bed, but the sheets were stained with dark water, the window gone, the crucifix on the wall turned upside down. Someone was humming a lullaby. Her lullaby. She sat up, and there she was. Her reflection, now walking freely through the room, examining the furniture, touching her books, smiling at her handwriting. "You rest," it said. "I'll tend to the hospital now. I remember how it used to be before you forgot." It turned toward the door, paused, and glanced back. "You can stay here, in the mirror. You belong there now." Evelyn leapt from the bed, grabbing the shard she'd kept hidden beneath her pillow. With it, she slashed the reflection's wrist, but no blood came out. Instead, smoke poured forth, writhing and hissing as it spread across the room. The reflection did not flinch, it only smiled wider. Pain doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to you. And then Evelyn's body froze. Her breath caught in her chest. The shard fell from her fingers. The reflection leaned close, whispering, "When you wake again, you won't be you." By morning, the nurses found her wandering the hallways, humming softly, her eyes clouded like frost. She greeted them one by one, gentle, calm, her movements precise, but her shadow on the wall moved half a second too late. When Sister Miriam asked if she was feeling better, Evelyn smiled and said, "I've never been better. The hospital is alive again." That night, the West Wing reopened by itself. All the covered mirrors were uncovered, and inside each reflection stood Evelyn watching, waiting, smiling slightly too wide. The monsoon had returned, darker than before. Street Helena's corridors dripped like wounds, and the air was thick with wet earth and rust. The patients who remained cowered in their beds, whispering prayers, their eyes darting toward the nurses or what they had become. Evelyn moved among them now, her steps silent, precise, almost ceremonial. She no longer seemed herself. Her eyes were calm, her voice melodic, soothing, but every word carried the weight of command, a subtle pull at the will of those who heard her. It began with the first nurse, Sister Miriam. Evelyn entered her room at midnight, the candle flame bent toward her as if drawn to her presence. "Come," Evelyn said softly, and Miriam obeyed. She followed her to Ward 3, the sealed one. Inside, Evelyn placed her hand on Miriam's chest. The warmth poured from Evelyn's palm into her body, a burning, suffocating heat. Miriam gasped, fell to the floor, then rose perfectly still, her eyes glazed. "Do you feel it?" Evelyn asked. "It's peaceful," Miriam whispered. "Only for a moment," Evelyn said. "And then it consumes you." By the second night, the remaining staff had begun to vanish. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, all lured into the West Wing, into the old wards, by the soft cadence of Evelyn's voice. The hospital seemed to breathe with her movements, walls shifting, corridors lengthening, ceilings descending, floors rising like tides. Even the lamps bent toward her as she passed, their flames flickering blue, green, and black. In the great hall, she arranged the bodies of the departed staff perfectly aligned, faces serene, hands folded. She pressed her hand to each one, and they shivered as if the fever itself had moved from corpse to living. When she stepped back, she saw them all, eyes open, lips stitched with invisible thread, faces her own. The hospital had changed. No longer mere stone and brick, it had become a living vessel. The ceilings pulsed with blood, the floors whispered with breath, and the walls exhaled mist that smelled of decay and rain. It fed on the fear, the mercy, the guilt of those it enclosed. Every living soul inside was a meal, a vessel, a copy waiting to happen. Evelyn wandered the halls. Wherever she stepped, the building seemed to lean toward her, moving subtly, like a great beast, shifting in its sleep. She hummed the lullaby the ghost had sung, and the walls pulsed in time, the very foundations echoing with the rhythm of death. By dawn, the hospital was quiet, but the air was alive, thick, humid, breathing. A patient who had survived the night whispered to a nurse, "The floors, they move. I swear I saw them breathe." And she was everywhere at once. Evelyn stood on the highest balcony, looking over the flooded city. The rain reflected countless mirrors of her own face, and for a brief moment she understood. The hospital had chosen her. She was no longer just Evelyn Hart. She was Street Helena's. That night, the bell rang once in the chapel, the sound hollow, deep, and eternal. From the windows, the few remaining villagers swore they saw dozens of nurses, all identical, walking the corridors in perfect silence, carrying lanterns, humming a lullaby for the dead. And in the east wing, where the river lapped at the walls, a figure stood at the gates, Evelyn Hart, smiling. "Come inside," she whispered to the storm. "The feast is ready." The Ganges had swollen beyond its banks. The city was shrouded in fog, water creeping into the streets like the hands of the dead. At first, the villagers thought it was the monsoon, another seasonal flood. But then they began to notice the shapes in the water, shadows moving too deliberately, too upright. Evelyn watched from the top of Street Helena's, the rain plastering her hair to her forehead. The hospital had grown taller in the night, its walls stretching impossibly, windows appearing where none had been before. From every balcony and tower, light-shone lanterns held by figures identical to her own face, all silent, all waiting. By dusk, the first cries came. A fisherman stumbled into the flooded streets, screaming about nurses appearing from the mist, hands outstretched, humming a lullaby. Children vanished from their homes. Dogs fled the city, howling at nothing. And the survivors swore the water itself reached into their homes, rising unnaturally, pooling at doorways, cold as grave soil. The hospital's west wing had opened fully, a yawning maw. From it emerged nurses carrying lanterns, walking along the flooded streets, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They moved like a river, silent but unstoppable. And wherever they stepped, shadows clung to the buildings, stretching and writhing, as if the city itself was alive with rot and breath. Evelyn walked among them, her hands guiding, her steps precise. She was calm, beautiful, terrible. The fever pulsed beneath her skin, a tide of memory, hunger, and power. She hummed the lullaby, and the shadows followed, filling every alley, every courtyard. The city was a reflection of Street Helena's, now its streets corridors, its citizens, patients, its buildings. Walls of a living ward. A merchant tried to flee down a side street. Evelyn's shadow detached itself from her body, sliding across the water to meet him. He fell to his knees, paralyzed by dread, and in the reflection of the street puddles, he saw her face multiply dozens, hundreds of Evelyns, all staring at him. The lullaby wrapped around him, tightening, suffocating. By dawn, he was gone, swept away by the river, his body never found. From the riverbank, other survivors fled to the bridges and boats. But the water itself had grown teeth. It pulled at the oars, the planks, the hulls. Even those who escaped Street Helena's could not escape her. Evelyn's presence stretched across the city, the fever, now a living tide, moving through canals, gutters, drains, and the very stones of the streets. By nightfall, every streetlight reflected her face. Every mirror, every window, every puddle. 1,000 Evelyns humming the lullaby in perfect unison. The hospital's bell tolled once more, and the city shuddered in response. From the top balcony of Street Helena's, Evelyn looked down at Calcutta, flooded, broken, silent, yet alive. Her smile was faint but unyielding. The river whispered back to her, "All is ready." The city was no longer just flooded. It was transformed. Streets twisted like veins, buildings rose impossibly tall, and every puddle reflected her face. Evelyn walked among the survivors, but no one dared call her by name. The fever pulsed through her like a second heartbeat, a rhythm that bent the city to her will. In the West Wing, she stood before the remaining patients, all still alive, clinging desperately to mortality. "Tonight," she whispered, "you will be discharged." Her hands hovered over their chests. The air grew thick, wet, and warm. And slowly, impossibly, the patients began to convulse, but not with pain. They convulsed with memory. Every life they had lived, every fear, every sorrow, burning outward in light and shadow. By dawn, the last living patient had either vanished or been transformed. Their faces were still, serene, stitched in places that had not been humanly touched. Evelyn stood in the center of the ward, breathing the rhythm of the hospital. The bell tolled once, low and final, marking the first time in centuries that no nurse resisted the fever. The city was no longer just flooded, it was transformed. Streets twisted like veins, buildings rose impossibly tall, and every puddle reflected her face. Evelyn walked among the survivors, but no one dared call her by name. The fever pulsed through her like a second heartbeat, a rhythm that bent the city to her will. In the West Wing, she stood before the remaining patients, all still alive, clinging desperately to mortality. "Tonight," she whispered, "you will be discharged." Her hands hovered over their chests. The air grew thick, wet, and warm. And slowly, impossibly, the patients began to convulse, but not with pain. They convulsed with memory. Every life they had lived, every fear, every sorrow, burning outward in light and shadow. By dawn, the last living patient had either vanished or been transformed. Their faces were still, serene, stitched in places that had not been humanly touched. Evelyn stood in the center of the ward, breathing the rhythm of the hospital. The bell tolled once, low and final, marking the first time in centuries that no nurse resisted the fever. The hospital began to rise. Street Helena's was no longer bound to earth. Its walls stretched skyward, towers bending, windows glowing with blue fire. The flooded streets reflected its impossible form, a giant mirrored in water and shadow. Evelyn felt her duality intensify, the reflection within her becoming stronger, her body both hers and the original Evelyn's. She moved through the halls, feeling every heartbeat of the building as her own. The nurses she had transformed walked in perfect lines, all humming the lullaby. The fever flowed like water through them, through the floors, through the walls, through the city itself. She stepped onto the balcony and looked down at Calcutta. The river hissed, and in its waters she saw faces, all the living she had passed, all the dead she had kept. And in the mist, the original Evelyn appeared beside her reflection. "You see now," the figure said, voice like silk and steel. "We are the fever. We are eternal." The city trembled, and the walls of Street Helena's shuddered in response, rising taller, stretching, consuming space itself. The final night came like a slow eclipse. The city of Calcutta had been swallowed by water, shadow, and mirrors. The bell tolled endlessly. A low vibration felt in every chest and bone. Evelyn stood in the highest tower. All around her, the hospital breathed, pulsed, and hummed. Her two selves, the living and the reflection, merged fully, and the duality of mercy and horror became a single, perfect predator. From the river, Shadows moved citizens and survivors, drawn into the wards as if the streets themselves were veins feeding the fever. Lanterns floated on the water, each one carrying a soul, a fragment of life that refused to vanish. Every mirror, every window, every reflective surface across the city now held her gaze. Her voice echoed across the streets, high and low, soft and commanding. All who enter shall remain. All who remain shall serve. The hospital never discharges. By morning, Calcutta no longer existed as a city, only street. Helena's remained impossibly tall, towers of glass, brick, and living stone, floating above the flooded streets. The river had become black, smooth as obsidian, reflecting the innumerable Evelyns walking the corridors. And from above, the bell tolled without hands, echoing forever through water, fog, and sky. Inside, the patients transformed into mirrors of herself, hummed the lullaby endlessly. And Evelyn Hart, both living and reflection, moved among them, the ultimate nurse, the eternal guardian of the fever. No one would ever be discharged again. The hospital had become a city, a fever, a god, and she, its immortal heartbeat. Asterisk. And so ends the tale of Evelyn Hart, the nurse who became the fever itself, and the hospital that never discharges. Street. Helena stands, waiting, its corridors filled with shadows, mirrors, and whispers of the past. If this story chilled you, give it a like, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another haunting tale. Share where you're watching from in the comments, because the next story could be coming for you. Asterisk.